I thought I should begin by making two very dodgy kind of knight's moves in chess to get anywhere near to the theme of this symposium. And it's sort of drunken knight's moves. And the first one is to make some sort of equation between representation and art and poetry. So maybe that's already taking us into quite dodgy areas, because maybe poetry isn't really a representation, as Octavio Paz said and Darren pointed out earlier. And the second knight's move is to suggest that we might, even before we talk about such things as art and poetry, we might talk about how we approach them. And so this is really about sort of ways of approaching a poem and a poet. Let me begin with two stories, both set in the same place. Can you hear me at the back there? Yeah. Both set actually in the classics faculty at Cambridge University. The first story takes place in May 1914, rather a poignant time. A. Housman, poet and professor of Latin at Cambridge, is lecturing on the seventh ode from the fourth book of Horace's Odes. This is the ode which begins, Di fugere nives, redeunt iam gramina campis. Horace is dissecting the ode in his usual dry, forensic manner. Suddenly, he pauses. Perhaps he takes off his glasses, if he wore glasses, which I don't know, wipes them, replaces them. He addresses the class in a different, humbler tone. I should now like to consider this ode purely as poetry. We don't know exactly what Housman said as he left the beaten track of scholarship, but we do know that after his remarks, he proceeded to read the ode aloud, first in Latin, and then in his own translation, which I was going to do. I don't know whether this will be a terrible bore for you if I read the ode in Latin, but I thought I would give it a try. So here we go. This is Horace Odes, Book 4, number 7. Di fugere nives, redeunt iam gramina campis, arboribusqui comai, mutat terra vices, et de crescentia ripas flumina praetereunt. Gratia cum nymphis geminisque sororibus, audet ducere nuda coros. Immortalia ne speres, monet annus, et almum quae rapit ora diem. Frigera mitescunt zephyris, ver proterit aestas, in territura simul, pomifer autumnus fruges effuderit, et mox bruma recurrit in Eyres. Damna tamen celeres reparant caelestia lunae, nos ubi decidimus, quo pius Aeneas, quo tullus dives et ancus, pulvis et umbra sumus. Quiscit an adiciant hodiernae crastina summae tempora di superi. Cuncta manus avidas fugient heredis, amico quae dederis animo. Cum semel occideris et de te splendida minos fecerit arbitria. Non torquate genus, non te facundia, non te restituit pietas. Infernis nequanim tenebris Diana pudicum liberat Hippolytum, nec Leithaia valet Theseus abrumpere caro, vincula pirithor. So that was the ode in Latin. And then Housman read it in his own translation, which goes like this. The snows are fled away, leaves on the shores and grasses in the mead renew their birth. The river to the riverbed withdraws, and altered is the fashion of the earth. The nymphs and graces three put off their fear, and unapparelled in the woodland play. The swift hour and the brief prime of the year say to the soul, thou wast not born for aye. Thaw follows frost. Hard on the heel of spring treads summer, sure to die, for hard on hers comes autumn with his apples scattering. Then back to wintertide, when nothing stirs. But oh, whate'er the sky-led seasons mar, moon upon moon rebuilds it with her beams. Come we where Tullus and where Ancus are, and good Aeneas, we are dust and dreams. Torquatus, if the gods in heaven shall add the morrow to the day, what tongue has told? Feast then thy heart, For what thy heart has had, the fingers of no heir will ever hold. When thou descendest once the shades among, the stern assize and equal judgment err. Not thy long lineage, nor thy golden tongue, no, nor thy righteousness shall friend thee more. Night holds Hippolytus, the pure of stain. Diana steads him nothing, he must stay. And Theseus leaves Pirithous in the chain. The love of comrades cannot take away. Some of the students noticed that the famously dry professor's eyes were filling with tears. That I regard as the most beautiful poem in ancient literature, he managed to blurt out before turning round and hurrying from the hall. The second story takes place 62 years later. I have gone up to Trinity College, Cambridge, Housman's College, on a classics scholarship in the autumn of 1976. One of the hottest, driest summers on record has given way to a cold, rainy Cambridge autumn. Holed up in my student bedsit above Sydney Street. No, I didn't get one of those sets in Great Court, for anyone who knows Trinity. I was struggling with Greek composition. My main interest in classics was in poetry, particularly Greek and Latin lyric poetry, maybe rather narrow. But I'm finding that my director of studies, Roger Daw, a disciple of A.E. Housman, has a strictly philological and textual interest in classical literature. The Holy Grail is the recension of classical texts. Nothing so frivolous as a purely literary approach to ancient literature is encouraged. We read some poems or fragments of poems by the archaic Greek lyric poets, the poets Horace idolized and emulated, Alcaeus, Sappho, Archilochus. But about the emotional meaning, as opposed to the grammar, the syntax, the meter of the poem, our young tutor, a shy blonde Scot called David Mackay, is silent. I come to a momentous decision. I'm going to change from classics to English, the subject I really love, to which I was planning to change after part one. English, the only faculty which welcomes emotion. The part memoir, part literary biography, Horace and me, I'm doing some shameless promotion here. Well, I don't have any copies to sell you. Which I wrote last year, called Horace and Me, Life Lessons from an Ancient Poet, is in part a meditation on the meaning of those two stories. What does the Housman story mean, for a start? I think it's quite complicated. It wasn't that Housman didn't understand the emotional power and pull of poetry. He understood it only too well. In A Shropshire Lad, published in 1895, he had written the quintessential elegiac late Victorian book of lyrics, and at the same time a book which somehow prefigured the loss of young life in World War I. But Housman had to keep two sides of himself, the lover and lyric poet and the Don, strictly separate. W.H. Auden wrote a famous sonnet on Housman, and he saw this as a conscious act of splitting. The Don Housman kept the tears of the homosexual lover Housman like dirty secrets in a drawer. Housman chose to devote his professional life to the driest kind of scholarship. He elected to make a major edition, not of Horace or Propertius, the poets he really loved, but of the minor versifier Manilius, whose book on astrology must rank as one of the most obscure in the entire annals of poetry. There, at least, he could, in savage footnotes, express the biting anger and contempt for other scholars, which might otherwise have been directed against himself. Tom Stoppard, in his play The Invention of Love, mounts a defense of Housman's scholarship as a practice of stoic virtue. Housman had loved deeply once. He regarded homosexuality as a shameful misfortune, but nothing he could do about it. But his love for the scientist rower Moses Jackson was not requited. Housman accepted the loss. Maybe he could no longer write lyric poetry, but he could exercise his matchless skill at classical scholarship for the common good. As Housman put it, the pursuit of knowledge, like the pursuit of righteousness, is part of man's duty to himself. I say that to be fair to Housman. Of course, I don't quite see it, and I don't feel quite the same way as Tom Stoppard. But Housman obviously felt that poetry as poetry mattered. Why else would he have been a poet? Something he never renounced. Maybe it mattered so much that it couldn't be spoken about, or only on very rare occasions. But Housman's disciples and successors, like my director of studies, Roger Daw, inherited the dry scholarly mantle, but not the warm heart which beat beneath. The affectation of not talking about the poetry as poetry had hardened into a rigid rejection. Surely I would find things different when I switched to English, the faculty of emotion. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper, up to a point. When I arrived in the English faculty, after a fairly short space of time, I have to say, less than one term, I found that it was convulsed by bitter academic acrimony. Some of you may know the story, but it came to a head in the refusal of tenure to the structuralist literary critic and lecturer Colin McCabe in 1981. A cause célèbre in which the two biggest beasts of Cambridge English, the traditionalist Christopher Ricks and the more theoretically minded Frank Commode, were bitterly opposed. And what all this signified was the approach or invasion of the good ship theory, crossing the channel rather belatedly, laden with the heady ideas which had brought students out onto the streets and toppled a government in Paris in May 1968. Theory was a mixture of Nietzschean relativism, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, Debordian situationism, but above all, the combination of Saussurean linguistics and Levi-Straussian structural anthropology. By the way, you're welcome to shoot the stand. I'd be very interested to hear what all of you think about that. Anyway, how could all that fail to be exciting and stimulating? How could any young person of mettle want to reject all that in favor of the old gentleman's club version of literary criticism? Horribile dictu, dear reader, I did. Some parts of theory I would later find fascinating and liberating, particularly bits of psychoanalysis. But the version of theory that was beginning to influence literary studies, the structuralist poetics promoted by Jonathan Culler and others, seemed in an odd way to share some of the least attractive aspects of the old dry textual criticism. And I wonder also whether it had some of the same origins and motivations, the desire to move from a wishy-washy, unstable subjectivism to firmer, quasi-scientific ground. Levi-Strauss had found certain rules relating to kinship, cooking, shame, and so on, that applied across cultures. Saussure had argued that languages were essentially systems of differentiation, whose individual features lacked intrinsic meaning. In his famous 1967 essay, Roland Barthes proposed the death of the author. All this seemed to leave literature as a sort of machine for generating meanings, in which larger cultural and structural elements were far more important than individual quirks of style. Theory, I think, was in part an exercise of power, shifting emphasis from self-indulgent authors, marinaded in outdated sentiment, to cold clinical theoreticians, standing in some way outside their culture in order, mercilessly, to explore its contradictions. All this reminded me of the conversation in David Lean's film version of Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, I'm not sure if any of you remember that, between two of Lara's lovers, Zhivago himself, the divided but deeply human doctor and poet, and Strelnikov, the terrifying cold ideologue. You may remember he traveled around in this extraordinary train, which was particularly terrifying, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to the greater good. Feelings, insights, affections, it's all suddenly trivial now, says Strelnikov. You don't agree, you're wrong. The personal life is dead in Russia. History has killed it. The private life is dead for a man with any manhood. But I couldn't accept this idea of the death of the author, not just because I felt sustained by relationships with authors, but also because it would imply my own death as a would-be author. Where would the death of the author leave the poet, especially the lyric poet, speaking with the voice of interiority and subjectivity? Thinking back on it, it seems to me that both the textual critics like Daw and the new theoreticians were refusing to face up, let me put it that way, face up to the poem and the poet. They were being, it seems to me, in some way discourteous, thinking of the word courtesy as Yeats uses it, and at the worst, maybe murderous. In one of his most famous short poems, W.B. Yeats delivers a magnificent tirade against dry scholars, which I got somewhere. Some of you may know this poem, The Scholars by W.B. Yeats. Bald heads, forgetful of their sins, old, learned, respectable bald heads, edit and annotate the lines that young men tossing on their beds rhymed out in love's despair to flatter beauty's ignorant ear. All shuffle there, all cough in ink, all wear the carpet with their shoes, all think what other people think, all know the man their neighbour knows. Lord, what would they say did their Catullus walk that way? And you may think this poem is somewhat unfair too, which it probably is. The scholars have become the gatekeepers of the Latin love poets. They're all experts in the minutiae of the text, but they've completely forgotten, if they ever knew, what might have brought the text into being, what it might have been like to be Catullus or Propertius or Horace. If the real Catullus suddenly appeared among them, they wouldn't have the faintest idea what to say to him. So I'm suggesting that both the old-fashioned textual critics and the newfangled theoreticians have had a tendency to objectify poetry. They tend to see it in terms of tradition, influence, precedent, or cultural and linguistic patterning. The personal encounter with the poem, or even the poet, has vanished or has been banished. And obviously you probably can tell, because I wrote a book called Horace and Me, my approach was really quite the opposite. I started with the personal. I wanted to tell the story of how I struggled with Horace at school. Some didn't entirely like him, actually. But then I forged a connection with him through wine. This is something, anyway, this you can read about it in the book if you're interested. But who could doubt, reading the Odes, that Horace was one of the greatest and most perceptive wine lovers of all time? Not just a nouveau riche wine snob, as Boris Johnson has rather unkindly put it, but someone who saw right through to the soul of wine, or l'âme du vin, as Baudelaire called it, wine's connection with the divine. So the connection was forged, but it lay dormant for decades. And here I realized, when I was researching the book, I was repeating the experience of an earlier lover of Horace, Rudyard Kipling. Kipling wrote in his autobiography, Something of Myself, that his Latin teacher at school, the model for the teacher in Storky & Co., in the story Regulus, which is a wonderful short story about this teacher, rather crusty teacher, teaching a very difficult Horace poem to a rather recalcitrant bunch of schoolboys. But in fact, Kipling enormously admired this man. This Latin teacher, Kipling wrote, taught me to loathe Horace for 2 years, to forget him for 20, and to love him for the rest of my days and through many sleepless nights. And I must say, I never failed to be amazed by that quotation, because it's really quite extraordinary. It's almost unimaginable that could happen, I think, that you could go through such an experience of loathing a writer for 2 years and forgetting him for 20, and then loving him as much as Kipling did. And Kipling loved Horace to the extent that he actually wrote a 5th book of odes in Latin, in Horatian meters. So this had happened before. And then 20 years after struggling with Horace in the classroom, I found myself suddenly translating Horace's most famous poem, the one whose last line contains the famous injunction, Carpe diem, which has given its name to 1,000 wine bars, among other things. Perhaps I'll read that to you. It's not very long. But you may know that the poem, the Horace poem, is 8 lines long. This is my translation. Don't ask, prudence. It's better not to know. Correction, we can't know what the end will be. You and I are doomed, yes, but the doom's an open one. Don't trust the tipsters' tables, the wise after the event predictors. We had better live through it now, this winter, if we're lucky, the next, some spring to come. One day the sea will cease its raging at the rocks. Not yet, I guess. Wisdom's what we need, and wine, and the long, slow art of cutting back for richer, later fruit. As we speak, the seconds tick away. Today is ripe for tasting. Who knows what tomorrow's fruit will be? So it's quite a kind of free translation. It seems to me that translating a poem is about as close a personal connection as you can really make with the poem and the poet. It involves, and I'm not, this is the subject of an entirely different talk, but it involves the blending of two voices into one. It involves a sort of soul communion, I think, which of course is impossible, really. But certainly scholarly objectification won't take you very far when it comes to translating a poem successfully. At least if that process of translating is what Ezra Pound called making it new. And Housman, of course, knew that when he came to translate De Fugere Niues. And that's why he made it into a poem which partakes of the spirit of Housman as well as the spirit of Horace. And it wasn't just Housman. As I carried on reading for this book, I was very struck that writers over centuries, not just writers but other people, many people over the centuries, had an extraordinarily personal relationship with Horace. They'd approached him not as a text to be studied or dissected, but almost as a friend. These authors range from Petrarch, who addressed a fulsome verse letter to Horace in the 14th century, Montaigne, Ben Jonson, who wrote a play in which Horace appears as a character, Alexander Pope, who modelled his whole writing life really on Horace, and Voltaire. And I'd like to read you Voltaire's very touching verse epistle to Horace, which goes like this, translated by me, not that brilliantly, I'm afraid, but anyway, you get the sense. I've lived longer than you. My poetry will have a shorter life. But as I approach my grave, I'm going to put all my efforts into following the lessons of your philosophy, into despising death and savouring the taste of life, into reading your writings full of grace and good sense, as one drinks an old wine which makes one feel young. Your maxims and your verses, your spirit dedicated to justice and truth, your contempt for hell, all that convinces me that Horace died an honest man. The least citizen in Rome died like that. There you would never see the Abbé Grisé tormenting a sick man in the name of eternal God. You get a bit there of Voltaire's sort of quite fierce anti-clericalism. But so he saw Horace, you can see, as a sort of close ally. And this carried on throughout the 19th century. All sorts of figures in many countries, Leopardi, Goethe. At the time of the French Revolution, the Marquis de Condorcet died with a copy of Horace's Odes by his bed. He was sadly a victim of Robespierre's purges. It went on through the 19th century, the late 19th century. The English Prime Minister, Gladstone, translated all of Horace's Odes really quite well. And on into the 20th century, as we've seen with Housman and Kipling. At that point, this rather stops, or certainly there's a pause. And the reason for that is that Wilfred Owen, and he's a poet it's good to remember at this time, the centenary of the First World War. Wilfred Owen stuck the knife into Horace in his savage poem Dulce et decorum est, in which he quotes that line from Horace, which is sweet and fitting to die for your country, in a very bitter, very effective manner. Perhaps he stuck the knife in deeper than any poet has ever stuck a knife into a fellow poet, certainly with enormous effect, because I'm not really sure Horace has ever quite recovered from that attack. But again, that's another story. To get back to my main point, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, this is about how to approach a poem and a poet. I found that over the centuries, fellow writers, and not just writers, had approached, valued, and loved Horace's poems, and Horace is, in a way, just an example here, in an intensely subjective way. Maybe because Horace stressed the value of friendship in his poetry so much. So many of his poems are addressed to friends and about friendship. His poems, because of that, I think Horace's readers tended to regard him as a friend, and his poems not as objective texts to be studied in order to gain knowledge about them or to become experts, but as sources of consolation, life guidance, wisdom. At a certain point, I think this subjective approach gave way to what I've called scholarly objectification. Horace began to be studied, perhaps more than he was read in the old way. First, the rigorous textual scholarship of the late 19th century in Germany and then in England, and then in the late 1970s, the new theoretical approaches which arrived from France. Maybe something was gained from these approaches, but something was also lost, I think. There seems to me to be something discourteous or even violent about approaching a poem or a poet with this kind of scholarly objectivity or objectifying a poet in this sort of way. You may well disagree, but perhaps it's time to restore a friendly connection with the poem and the poet. Thank you.